and we're having a discussion about this manhunt that is currently underway in London after the criminal that sparked the Epping riots has been accidentally let go and is, at time of record, still on the loose. But what I think we often forget when we are having these types of conversations, and as a previous caller has pointed out, they can very quickly become political in nature, is that there are victims and survivors who are going to find this incredibly triggering and are often missed from the conversation. So that's why I'm pleased now to be joined by Lucy Duckworth, who's policy advisor at the Survivors Trust. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Good evening.
In terms of the press coverage of this manhunt, what impact do you think that could be having on survivors of sexual assault?
I mean, I think we've had press coverage pretty much of all week of sexual violence or child sexual abuse or child sexual exploitation. We've seen it across all charities and all organisations, a huge increase in calls to helplines, in asks for help. And to anyone out there listening, that's not that we don't want that. We welcome you with open arms, but it just proves the huge impact that it does have. What we do know about disclosures of any form of sexual violence is that it takes years for people to be able to say what's happened to them. It's 25 years for women and 36 years for men. And we need to really understand the huge impact that this subject has on people around the country whenever a story like this hits the press.
And, I'm thinking about both stories. I'm thinking about the Bell Hotel protests and also about the ongoing saga of the Epstein files over in the US. Both of these have been used as political footballs without perhaps taking into account there are people who still feel the impact of the perpetration of this kind of criminal activity. And in the case of the Epstein files, remember what happened. So how do you think that this should be talked about in a way that is more sensitive and more acknowledging of victims?
Well, I think we just need to leave it to the people who really do understand, and that is always the victims and the survivors and the people who work in that sector. I have been absolutely amazed this week by the amount of social media of people giving analyses of politicians' responses or what's going on when actually they don't know. They've not worked in it themselves. They don't know what is actually happening and what has happened to get us to this point. What we do know is that as a society, we are still treating this as a massive taboo. And I think that's actually been seen, because even though it feels like we're talking about this more, what we're actually doing is talking about individual cases and trying to blame individuals. And we're not accepting the prevalence of it in society as a whole. The fact that 500,000 children are sexually abused in this country every single year is something that should be alarming to all of us. And we need to really start putting the victims first and listening to them, and not jump into conclusions and using it for our own political gain, because we've seen that to a shameful response this week in every single story that this is covered in.
And I suppose you could also make that argument about what's happening with Jess Phillips's presence in the grooming gang inquiry. I think last time I checked, there were 4 victims who said that they would not continue unless Jess Phillips stepped down. And then there were 5 victims who said that they would not continue unless she stayed. And it's just such a shame that they have to be caught up in the trajectory of Jess Phillips' career rather than kind of getting on with the work, isn't it?
Indeed, and how we got to a situation where we're putting all the answers into one minister or one individual. We've seen this with some of the other extremely high-profile cases this year, like you said about Epstein. This isn't down to one individual. If we remove one individual, and I'm not saying that people shouldn't be held accountable for their mistakes, they absolutely should, but that's not going to solve the issue we have with sexual abuse, the fact that there are 14 million adult survivors of sexual violence in this country. The problem with this subject is it's extremely complex in the layers of trauma that it presents. And, you're not affected by it until you are, and then when you are, it's too late. And we keep responding to it rather than putting all our efforts into prevention, and that is what we are fighting for so hard at IICSA and at the Survivors Trust. And we really need to get a grip on prevention, because if there was any other subject that affected 500,000 children every year, there would be an outcry. And I still don't understand why we're not all collectively coming together to make sure that is stopped.
And what specifically are you calling for in terms of prevention? Like what needs to happen?
We want all of the independent inquiry 20 recommendations. It was published 3 years ago, and it made 20 key recommendations for child protection reform, and we want all of those implemented. 3 years later, not one of them has been implemented, and now we're looking at a new inquiry into grooming gangs. Of course, it's a separate issue, but we need to stop having consultations, and we need to start actually acting on the prevention that we know is needed. We need to listen to the experts and actually make sure that we are working on better prevention and better response methods. And that includes training our frontline professionals, working with families, having a national campaign to educate everybody about these issues and how they can protect their children, and reforming our criminal justice system to act as a bigger deterrent to those in position of trust who think that they can do this crime and not be held to account.
And you make a really good point, actually, that there have been so many reports. The J report, just off the top of my head, I think is the most recent one. Mm-hmm. And rather than enacting and implementing the recommendations in those reports, it seems that we're just commissioning more and more reports until people get the answer that they want.
Absolutely, or until we pass it down to the next government, and then it's somebody else's problem. And it's because it's a really, really difficult subject to get our head around, because it affects every area of society. And this is why it's been so heartbreaking this week to see people say, well, it's only happening here, or it's only happening by this person. That's not going to change the widespread society issue we have with all forms of sexual violence and child sexual abuse and child sexual exploitation. It doesn't care whether your victim is affluent in a boarding school or from a low-income family. It doesn't care who the perpetrator is. Everybody is at risk from it, and everybody is at risk from it because we don't have the prevention in this country that we know we need to have. And we have plenty of reports that have advised us to do that, but all governments to this date have ignored them.
Lucy Duckworth, thank you so much for your time this evening, policy advisor at the Survivors Trust there, with some really important words, I think. I'm really glad that we had the opportunity to speak to her this evening. Let's go now to Tiago in